Thank you all for joining today, and we are indeed happy to welcome on behalf of Dharmajyoti Vidyapeeth, on behalf of our principal who couldn't join today, Reverend Dr. Sunny E. Matthew, and all the staff and the students who have joined. Thank you all, each one of you all. Especially Dharmajyoti Vidyapeeth has a legacy of around 21 years now as a seminary of the Marthoma Church. This is for those who are new to this, who are friends or who are students of Dr. Nagmani Rao, for them just giving an introduction. So it's been here for the last 21 years. And we have students from different forums, from different persuasions of different denominations also. So it's a great honor for us to host something like this today under the auspices of the Dalit Theology course that we have for the BD final year students. And as we expose them to various literature and everything. So passing away of Gail Omved, Dr. Gail Omved on 24th April 2021, which was one of the corrections that Dr. Nagmani Rao made, because everyone in the academia and everyone in the media has made it as 25th. It's on 24th. And that's where we, because of her eminence, because of how important she is, we really wanted to hear a little more, especially for the students too. So let me take this time and opportunity to first introduce you a little bit about, and that the major portion would be done by Dr. Nagmani Rao, but I will just request all of you all to, whoever has the audio muted so that there is no disturbance at a later stage. Gail Omved was born in Minneapolis in US on August 2, 1941, and she is a very recognized scholar in a lot of sense. She came in 1960s for a brief period. She was also the student of another legendary scholar called Dr. Eleanor Zealot, who also had the same trajectory of studying caste and coming to India. But she, on her second stint, she came and she settled. Her PhD thesis was Cultural Revolt in Colonial Society, the non-Brahmin movement in Western India from 1873 to 1930. So she came and she also was especially studying in depth about Mahatma Phule, Jyotiba Phule, and the Satyashodak Samaj. And her lifelong quest was the Marxist, Buddhist, Phuleite intersections. And I think Dr. Nagmani Rao would be helping us to decipher all those things later. What is very interesting about Dr. Gail Omved is that she is seen as a grounded, and that's the term that Dr. Nagmani Rao has also coined, a grounded activist scholar, because she bridged the gap between academia and the activism. And she was always around, and along with her husband, Bharat Pathankar, they started a social political platform called Shramik Mukti Dal, which is also called as the Toilers Liberation League, if you want to translate that. And there was an intersection of farmers and workers in this entire thing, and especially in Kasegaon, Maharashtra. So these are some of the peripheral informations that I am giving to you. She was an avid scholar. She has written loads and loads of books, a very profound scholar in that sense, at the same time at the forefront for the Bahujan community. So it's in that sense that we locate her, and many of our friends who are from that field, who have also joined today, will later on ask questions and add on to that. So to come to the main resource person that we have today, it's my rather privilege to introduce to you Dr. Nagmani Rao, who was my teacher at Karve Institute of Social Service. She taught me from 2003 to 2005, and she is known for her passion, known for her activism, known for her erudite scholarship, for her writings, and for being very, very involved in all the movements possible. So whenever I have always imagined as a teacher, for me, the topmost name that comes to my mind is Dr. Nagmani Rao, for her commitment to academy, but at the same time, her concern for students. So it's been 16 years since I have graduated, but we have always remained in touch, and that's the impact that she's had on her students. I'll just give a very brief introduction to her qualifications or her expertise in that sense, but she has requested not to dwell too much into that because that's how she is. And she was one of the first one to tell us not to call her ma'am and things like that, call her by name, which we couldn't, I couldn't especially, but then here we go. She was the associate professor, now she's retired from that, at Karve Institute of Social Service. And she was associated with the Department of URCD, Urban and Rural Community Development. She has done her PhD in social work from the Savitribai Phule Pune University, and her research area was women and Panchayati Raj, an intersectional study. She was exploring that, and she started her studies. Her guide was initially the legendary sociologist Sharmila Rege, but we all know that she passed away in the year 2013, if I'm not wrong. And then she was guided by Dr. Deshmukh. And so in 2000, she finished her PhD in the field of social work, but with special concentration on women and Panchayati Raj. Her major area of expertise is gender, feminist issues, rural and urban community work, Panchayati Raj, social movements, social advocacy, and social action, research and skill training. Research and skill. She is a brilliant researcher, and she taught us. We had a skill lab, we had a research lab, how to write thesis, all these things. She was so meticulous, and so at that point of time, we would be like, why is she so particular about all these things? But we really stood in good stead because we were trained under the best. Her editorial skills, her writings, everything is phenomenal. So I think if I say more, she wouldn't be too happy to say that. But then also the same thing is that she is not just an academician, a very avid background of activism along with her husband Joy, and also involved in many other things. So with a lot of joy in my heart, along with my friends, along with the students of Dharmajyoti Vidyapeeth, I take it as a very big privilege to welcome Dr. Nagmani Rao, and I also call upon her to deliver the lecture. Can I spotlight you, ma'am? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Merin, for this undeservedly glowing tribute. I think let the students of your university decide how good or bad I am. And so don't get influenced by what Merin has said. You know, sometimes teachers and students share a very special relationship, and Merin and mine has been that. So take it as that. So I'm very happy that Merin invited me to talk to many of you who may have heard of Gail, read her, but perhaps did not know her. And so I have titled my presentation as Remembering Gail Omvedt, a grounded activist scholar. I'll begin a little bit about her background, her early years. From there, I will talk about Gail as a scholar and activist, and then, of course, my personal and family ties with her. So that's how it is going to flow. So probably some of you may find some who have read her certain things which are repetitive, but I'm sure the personal glimpses that I would be given would be things that perhaps you don't know. So let me begin. Gail was born in Minneapolis to Scandinavian origin American parents. Her paternal grandfather, August Omvedt, was in the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party. He served in the Minnesota legislature twice, first in 1937 for a year, and subsequently 1941 to 52. He also was a mayor of Minnesota. So in that sense, Gail comes from a legacy of liberal family background. Her mother was a homemaker. Her father was an attorney, but who also took up pro bono cases for the resource rights of Native Americans. Gail did her initial studies in the US. She was an undergrad in Carleton College and later did her post-graduation and PhD from the very famed University of California, UC, Center for Nobel Laureates and very radical movements in Berkeley. At the young age of 22, Gail visited India first in 1963 as a Fulbright scholar, when she worked as an English tutor and thus began her first engagement with India and its rural hinterland. In UC, she participated in students' agitations against war. This is in the 60s, which had a lot of churning going on. So she was there in these movements, the free speech movement, civil rights movement, and especially in supporting the Black Panther Party and the Women's Liberation Movement, which was emerging in the US. As Merin has mentioned, Eleanor Zillot was her teacher and she was influenced by her, and she decided to pursue her student on the anti-caste movements in India. And to do that, she prepared herself to read, write, and speak in Marathi so that she could also refer to original text. Speaks a lot for her personality. So her PhD work, which Merin has already talked about, focused on the Satyashodhak Samaj and Jyotirao Phule and his work, and till date remains one of the seminal works on analyzing anti-caste movements in India, not merely as one of rights assertion, but as one that struck at cultural hierarchies, which are the most difficult to break. This stay in India, through the process of fieldwork, firmed up her resolve to want to have a long-term affinity with rural India and her commitment. Bharat and Gail had their initial acquaintance in the office of Magowa in the early 70s when she was connected with the Magowa magazine. I'll tell you a little bit about Magowa a little later. In 1975, Gail took the initiative and asked Chhaya Datar, who is also a well-known feminist scholar and an activist, to introduce her to Bharat to get to know him better, with the idea of course, spending a life with him. So Gail and Bharat met at Chhaya Datar's house on what we would call their first date, and to discuss their future life together. Independently, she had also met Bharat's mother, Indumati. Affectionately, we called her Indutai, at a women's conference in the early 1970s during her research on the women's movement in Maharashtra. Indutai herself was a strong woman of mass struggles, who also waged many a personal battle as an activist and a freedom fighter during the struggles against colonial rule. Bharat and Gail got married in 1976 when the former was underground, that is Bharat, because he had opposed the emergency. The rituals, so they had a ritual wedding in the home of Comrade A.D. Bhosle and Leelatai Bhosle of Lal Nishan Party, who officiated as her parents by affinity at this ceremony. At that time, politically, Gail was not only related to the Lal Nishan Party, but was also associated with another young group called Yuvak Kranti Dal. Bharat was actively part of Magowa, which was a left group formed in the late 60s or early 70s. It was formed by left-leaning intellectuals as a discussion forum who was dissatisfied with what was happening. And so it became a forum for critical political discussion that also put Marx under the microscope. Bharat and Gail were amongst the founder members of Shramik Mukti Dal in 1980. It's actually a small political group with a lot of people who came out of mainstream left parties or unions. And this new left group had an ethos for critical thinking and the search for alternatives beyond the classical Marxian framework. Joy and I were also part of this group from the early 80s. Bharat, a little bit about him. He was a medical doctor by training. He gave up the profession while doing his MD in Mumbai. He was to specialize in gynecology. And as he was drawn into the mobilizing work with textile workers and also had grown in his political perspectives through Magova, in a sense, Bharat dawns the political legacy of his parents and grandfather. His maternal grandfather, Dinkar Rao Nikam of Indoli in Satara district, was a lead figure in the Prati Sarkar movement of Sangli, Satara, Kolhapur, and he was drawn towards communist thought. He was one of the earliest communists of that region. His own father, Krantiveer Babuji Patankar, was part of the left movement in Mumbai and in the underground anti-colonial movement. Inutai and he, in those days, were part of a commune and became partners during the freedom struggle. She came from a well-landed, high-caste Maratha family, and he was from a toiling peasant Kunbi family in Kasegaon, not very well-to-do. Bharat's father, in fact, was murdered by his opponents when the former was just a toddler. In fact, Babuji's body was never found. And young Indumati took on the care of the lands and family, her in-laws, on her strong shoulders, and also worked as a teacher. But she still retained her fervor for activism till almost the end of her life. Gail received her Indian citizenship through naturalization as late as 1983. Now let me dwell upon Gail, the writer, the scholar that I have known her as. She has been a scholar with a difference. For her, any writing or research went beyond the academic realm, as the starting point would be its relevance to social thinking and social movements. Her writings reflect her grounding in Marxism, her engagement with feminism, and her strong belief in the relevance of anti-caste movements to build a society with the vision of equality and equity, two very different words. Her theoretical work was not only in critical Marxism, but also feminist theory evolved by the women's liberation movement in the US, and then how she looked at the emerging Indian women's movement. Therefore, her writings reflect a rich scholarship of her activism influencing her writing, as well as her theoretical perspectives informing her stance as an activist. This wide span of scholarship, grounded in political experience, explains perhaps why Gail was a sought-after speaker and mentor to young and old, cutting across a gamut of progressive activists and scholars, and in particular, the respected position she was crowned with by the Dalit Bahujans amongst these. The Brahminical section had a lot of reservations about her, I may add. And yet, ironically, Gail's work has rarely been part of the academic curriculum in the social sciences and other relevant academic streams. As Merin mentioned, Gail has been a prolific writer, authored and co-authored books, articles in scholarly journals of repute. She has contributed papers in several edited books and also written for the popular press. Particularly, she had a column in Hindu for many years. When I'm talking about her writings, I'm drawing selectively from some of what I have read. I must admit that what I have read is but a speck in her voluminous writings, which I have accessed at various points on a very need-based approach, with a very need-based approach, for presentations, papers that I wrote, or for my PhD work. To really understand the complexities that Gail represented in her thinking as these evolved and unfolded over time, one needs to make a very serious engagement of reading her works at various points of time. Something that I now hope to do as my personal posthumous tribute to my pal, whose intellectual value many of us failed to appreciate during her lifetime. I think part of the reason for this is also that Gail wrote because she wanted to write about things she felt were meaningful, but she was never somebody who tried to project or promote her writings amongst anybody. So if we did read something and wanted to discuss it with her, she had no hesitation to do so, even if it meant discussing differences of opinion. Hence, in a sense, many of us, including those of us who have been closely associated with her, are rediscovering her after she has left us. This is something that I will personally regret always, because I have missed out on a lot of discussions and debates I could have engaged with her had I read many more of her writings earlier beyond its functional value. So I'm highlighting points from a few as briefly as possible. The first I will talk about is We Will Smash This Prison. This is the first writing of hers that I and many feminist scholars ever read. A book that documented the emergent women's movement in Maharashtra from the eyes of activists, and anecdotal presentation of struggle programs and events. Writing about the feminist struggles, Gail wove in conversations and participant observation methodologies with an analysis of issues and why these were relevant in contemporary times. In a sense, she was sowing the seeds of feminist research and documentation from the gendered lens in this book. When I first read Gail's We'll Smash This Prison, perhaps it was in 1980, the title captivated me as I had become part of the emerging contemporary autonomous feminist movement in Delhi, participating in collective campaigns against violence, dowry, and sexual violence. My journeys as a feminist trainer and community worker gave insights to understand the struggles of and negotiations by women who were Adivasis, Jats, and Muslims. These and the experiences of living and working in Delhi were helping me break out of my own protected, insulated environment that almost all middle class, privileged caste young women are encamped in. I began to learn to assert. So, in fact, all of us were smashing the prisons of patriarchy in different ways and learning how the personal is truly political. As I read the book, I was amazed at the lucidity and style with which she wrote, weaving in personal narratives with sharp analysis. I became a fan, little knowing then that in future we would become sisters and comrades in the struggle of rural women in Maharashtra. Personally, it also generated ideas for the area of my own research during my post-graduation, where I used the exploratory design and participatory methodology in data collection, something that was quite new at that time in academia, but my guide, Dr. Suma Chitnis, was convinced I could do it and gave me all the freedom, and I'm grateful to her. The second book I'm talking about is Building the Ambedkar Revolution, where Gail talks about Baba Saheb Ambedkar-led movement in the Konkan region. In this book, she throws light on forgotten leaders of the movement, such as Sambhaji Tukaram Gaikwad, Gopal Baba Walangankar, Mandke Bua, etc., etc. These would be strange names for many of you. While researching and sifting through and presenting historical facts, Gail's style goes beyond dry chronology, as she builds in the regional political context and social history, making her writings not only sharply analytical, but also easily understandable to the lay reader. For example, while introducing Sambhaji Tukaram Gaikwad, she places his name in context when she states, and here I quote, his names themselves testify to two great rebels in Maharashtrian history. Sambhaji as the oldest son of Shivaji, who is described as a brave king who lives in non-Brahmanic memory as a great rebel also against Brahmanism. Tukaram, one of the most radical of bhakti poets of the popular Warkari movement. And thus, quote ended, and thus Gail establishes the political and cultural rebellion in naming of a son from an untouchable caste in such renowned people's names. Elsewhere in the book, she also draws from folklore of oral histories while referring to the Chitpawals, or what we call in Maharashtra the Kokanists, the traditional landlords of this region, which claims of European genetic origin, who, through their affiliation to the Peshwas, became the dominant Brahmin caste in this region. The non-Brahmin referred to them as cobras, Kokanas Brahmin abbreviated, but also obtusely referring to the trait of the cobra snake. She averts the name, making quote unquote sparkling reference to the traditional saying, if you see a snake and Brahmin, kill the Brahmin first. Very tongue-in-cheek. Some people have scorned at her being journalistic in her writings, but I personally feel that this in fact is her strength, which makes her writing appealing beyond the ivory towers of academia. In the same book, Gale also highlights the class hierarchies within the untouchable castes, even within the Mahars who were in the service of the British Army and in the urban working class. A section of the Mahars were doing this. And the Mahars who continued to be in tradition bound, living in slavery in the villages. Ex-military men and those who retired from urban working class were thus seen as being in the forefront of the early Dalit movements. Citing from Pahle Dada Saheb, Sambhaji Tukaram was referred to as Dada Saheb by Ambedkar and many other young Dalit activists. So citing from Pahle Dada Saheb, from one of the later reports of Mahar Seva Sangh, she quotes, and here I'm only quoting a selective extract. I begin the quote, in those times, those half-educated pensioners who had retired from the military considered their ignorant and afflicted regional brothers to be inferior and treated them with scorn. Then how far away were they from behaving with a comradely manner towards them and giving them the benefit of their knowledge? So you can see the divisions even within subcastes as well as within the caste itself, which was supposed to be in the forefront of the Ambedkari movement. Gale avers that even before Ambedkar emerged as a mass leader, these grassroots resistances were in fact contributing to the withering away of traditions due to organizing by early leaders like Sambhaji Tukaram Gaikwad and the women. There were women also in this movement. These were awakening the consciousness amongst men and women in the Konkan that could be channelized by Baba Saheb Ambedkar subsequently. In the chapter describing Dada Saheb, Gale takes us through his personal and family history, first in his ancestral village Pahur and his later move to the new industrial metropolis Thane for reasons of livelihood, which exposed him to a relatively open urban environment, what Baba Saheb had talked about, and the opportunities to educate his children at least for a few years. She narrates the early resistances to caste by such people, including Dada Saheb and Govind Adrekar, Shivram Zadhav, and others in the Seven Roads area. It's an area in Thane. As the people, as well as the people like Revaji Bua Dolas, a textile worker and a Warkari living in the subaltern chawls in Kamathipura. Those of you who know Bombay will know that this is the well-known red light area. And talks about how these experiences molded Sambhaji's class aspirations as well as the strength to build the early movements of Mahar's assertion. The very interesting part of Gale's scholarship in this and many other books is the way in which she locates personal histories into the wider socio-political context while describing the political evolution of Dalit activists and their movements. Also, their early negotiations to demand legitimate rights within the Hindu realm, and then the process of assertion leading to a complete breakaway from the Hindu fold. It reflects not only her efforts to get a deep, empathetic, cultural understanding of the oppressed and suppressed communities, but also informs and motivates the reader to inspired perspectives by looking at things from such lenses. In the foreword to this book, Prakash Ambedkar writes, she has done a brilliant portrayal of the first Dada Saheb and other veteran Dalit leaders, even as she takes utmost care to ensure that factual accuracy and historical facts are not compromised. So Gale's writings, in fact, are a sort of a reflection of history of the times, and yet it is never referred to while reading history. A book which has been discussed a lot in recent times and is one of her later books is Seeking Begumpura. This book is a rich outcome of her tenure as a senior fellow of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in Delhi, which put her in touch with the visionary thoughts of the anti-caste sons of North India as well as the South. It covers a period of 5 centuries till just before the end of colonial rule in India. And it expands her horizons beyond Maharashtra. It presents a utopian vision of society that contrasts the Brahminical and Gandhian glorification of village utopia as Ram Rajya, which neither question caste or gender hierarchies as socially constructed subordinations. The very name, Begumpura, city without sorrow, envisioned by the radical saint Ravi Das, is the title of her book and presents the imagination of a casteless society, a modern society, one without mention of temples, an urban society, a land with no taxes, toil or harassment, where there is no hierarchy, but all are equal. This is a quote from the book. In the song Begumpura, Ravi Das describes himself as the liberated tanner. He belongs to the Chamar community who wanders freely with his friends, the right to walk anywhere in a settlement, city, or village. This indeed is a dream for Dalits whose very shadow following on the upper caste was considered sacrilegious enough to call for restrictions on their movement in villages. So in Seeking Begumpura, Gale juxtaposes the utopian visions of radical saints of pre-modern times and the radical thinkers, the radical reformers of the colonial so-called modern period, such as Jyotiba Phule, Pandita Ramabai, Periyar Ramaswamy, and Ambedkar. It highlights the debates they raise, pointing out the contradictions and inequities that are aggravated by development paradigms in contemporary India. They inspire the potential of resistance to these by subaltern sections to realize the utopia dreamt of in Begumpura. The book, when I read it, at once moves us and motivates us not only to dream, but creates fervor to be part of the struggles to move towards this utopia. Some of Gale's later writings cover various new social movements. I must admit that I've read none of these thoroughly, and due to time constraints, I will not go into the gist also, but 2 books which I strongly recommend is Understanding Caste from Buddha to Ambedkar and Beyond, where she's talked about the new Dalit movements such as the Dalit Panther, Kanshi Ram's movement, and so on, and Reinventing Revolution, New Social Movements and the Socialist Tradition in India, which talks about a range of movements in the 70s and 80s around caste, gender, environment, farmers' movement, which challenged the left movement in a very big way. What is striking in Gale's analysis in all these books is that, in these 2 books in particular and the new social movements, is that despite the fragmentation of progressive groups and politics, she does not give up hope at this disintegration, but poses self-reflexive questions on, this is a situation, so what should we do? And I think that explains the utopian imagination that she seeks to project in Seeking Begumpura. As stated elsewhere by another scholar, the point is not if we will achieve utopia, but of the positive changes we can bring while seeking utopia. So Gale's contribution to the socio-political understanding of the intersections of class, caste, patriarchy long before they came into contemporary academic discourse in women's study, history, and sociology, are pioneering. Drawing from Marxism, which talked about the material base of women's oppression and subordination, she also said that mere class analysis and Marxist theory are inadequate to talk of women's subordination, particularly in the Indian context. She understood the difference in these experiences according to women's caste location, and talks about the dual oppression of Dalit women who face patriarchal and social violence. These intersections that Gail highlighted came strongly to the fore when we were organizing the single deserted women through our Parityakta struggles, when the relevance of women getting land rights were being discussed for women to resist violence and assert an independent existence. The fact that women had no ownership of and control over productive assets, and in upper castes were also deprived of independent sources of income, enhanced their vulnerability, keeping them entrapped within boundaries due to notions of family honor. I can illustrate with discussions later if there are questions, please. So I want to also highlight that people like Ileana Zelliot and Gail, through their writings in English, have made remarkable contribution of taking radical ideas of Dalit Bahujan thinkers and their impacts beyond the regional audience in Maharashtra. Many works have been and continue to be translated from English to other regional languages also. This is an important contribution, not just in knowledge building, but also in spreading the philosophy on non-Brahmin revolutionary influences, which many of us outside the region would have been otherwise ignorant about. Now, let me come to the last part of my presentation, which talks about Gail, the activist, my comrade, my pal, and eventually my family. I first met Gail in 1983. I'd written to her when I was a student in TIS, but we laughed about it, but that's another story. I first met Gail in 1983, just before she was leaving for the US. And as I was beginning to work in the villages of Sangli district. My friend and later life partner Joy and I had decided to go and work in the villages in a drought-affected taluka in Sangli after our post-graduation at TIS. Joy and I did not know Marathi at that time, and Indutai was rather skeptical about our credentials, one from Delhi, another from Kerala, having passed out from an elite institution, etc., etc. But Gail was open to listening to us and told us about the emerging movement which was seeking to build a worker toiling peasant alliance and seeking alternatives. By the time Gail, and this really appealed to Joy and me. So by the time Gail returned after a few months, we had picked up functional Marathi and had bonded quite well with Indutai through village meetings, campaigning for Ushatai Nikam's first all-women's panel in the Indoli Gram Panchayat electoral contest in 1984. Ushatai was Indutai's sister-in-law, and we called her Mami. And also visiting each other's homes, we in Kamlapur, Tai in Kasegaon, and so on. We collectively established Mukti Sangharsh Movement, MSM, a mass organization, in October 1983. This mass organization had grown in the process of mobilizing support for striking textile workers and organizing the laborers and toiling peasants working on EGS sites. The aim was to build a strong worker-peasant alliance that sought scientific alternatives to drought and livelihood issues. Through the numerous mass campaigns of MS, the women were actively participating and in large numbers. Women were a large number in the EGS sites. As feminist activists, we also held separate meetings and periodic camps with women so that their voices could be articulated in the mass organizations. These processes brought us in touch with their specific issues: alcoholism, violence, the impact of drought and migration on women's livelihood and health, and so on. So, Sri Mukti Sangharsh, SMS, grew organically through these interactions and was formally inaugurated in March 1985. We, that is Indutai, Gail, and Gauri De, an activist who was originally from Bengal and was with us in the initial years, and myself. We had regular village meetings, both for involving women in the wider mass mobilization and also to highlight the denials and exclusions that women were experiencing. The issue of the large number of separated, deserted women came to the fore during these meetings, and we carried out surveys. So SMS was amongst the first organizations in Maharashtra to take up the issues of single women through the Parityakta struggles. We, as the core group of both MS and SMS, also traveled across the taluka to far-flung villages, mobilizing women for the mass struggles around free cattle camps, right to work and equal wages, and childcare facilities on EJS sites. The use of EJS works to prioritize drought eradication and enhance agriculture productivity. And during election campaigns, we also highlighted these issues. During these engagements, women talked to us about the cultivation of sugarcane and effects of alcoholism brewed by sugar factories, commercial sand excavation, its impact on men who were primarily employed as labor in this work, the increasing impacts of the drought that enhance violence and desertion of women, and a multitude of other issues that they had to deal with on a daily basis. Prachi, Gail and Bharat's little school-going daughter, she was born in 1978, was often with us when all of us put in our collective force for important campaigns, traveling continuously for days. Here I want to relate an anecdote. Sometime in 1984 or 85, I forget exactly, after a series of drought years, the conditions had become precarious, raising the horrific memories of the all Maharashtra drought of 1972, when peasants were compelled to release their cattle to fend for themselves, die due to the absence of fodder. The cattle were left to die due to absence of fodder, and the dire economic condition of the peasantry triggered by continuous crop failures. We demanded as a mass organization that the state, in partnership with sugar factories, should organize free cattle camps with fodder and water on their premises, as the wealth of sugar factories was built on the toil and land of the peasantries. This was easier said than done. After a series of struggles, we organized a day-long Rasta Roko roadblock in the entire taluka. Some of our key senior male activists were taken into preventive detention to weaken the strike call. We women decided to spread out and mobilize other women, and the authorities did not even suspect that this was happening under their very noses. They assumed women could not be mobilized for such a risky blockade that could result in their arrest or causing public obstruction. Since many of these meetings were late night meetings, Prachi was left behind in one of the base villages under Joy's care. On the date of the Rasta Roko, from early morning, people went into the highways leading and traversing through the taluka with their goats, bullock carts, etc. A huge sea of men, youth, women, and children squatting on the roads, singing liberation songs, and it brought the taluka to a standstill for an entire day. The government was compelled to take responsibility. The collector took out an order for the sugar factories, and a precedent was established in the state for free cattle camps under conditions of severe drought for the first time, something that later became a norm. Indutai once narrated another anecdote about Gail and Bharat's complete immersion during Andolans. This was during the long march for renaming Marathwada University after Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. Prachi was then just a toddler and was carried by her parents, grandmother, and other activists. The strain affected her and she developed severe diarrhea. But Gail and Bharat would not hear of dropping out of the march. Inutai told us how nervous she had become as she had lost her older son to diarrhea during the freedom struggle campaigns, and yet could see the passion in Gail and Bharat that built a sense of responsibility for the cause. As we today see a mature Prachi, politically engaged and making choices in life, We can see these influences have also ignited her thinking and commitments. She has never ever displayed an iota of resentment about denial or neglect, but rather expressed a sense of deep pride and respect for Indutai, Gale, and Bharat, people who shaped her political grounding. All this shows Gale definitely adapted to rural living in India beautifully, experiencing with efforts at decasting and declassing. At the same time, she was also a privileged daughter-in-law in having Indutai as mother-in-law. Hence, talking about Gale without talking about these support systems would be presenting a half-truth. Indutai realized early on that Gale was definitely not going to be the typical daughter-in-law that rural society would expect. And she stood solidly behind Gale, respecting her scholarship, accepting her passion for socio-political engagement, and offloading her from many care and daily responsibilities in the domestic domain. Indutai staunchly believed that if women activists have to lead, they should be released from the routine drudgery of care work to be able to participate fully in movement work. Such support and understanding established a mutually caring and respectful relationship between Gale and Indutai that endured till the end. The years of working together intensely brought Gale and me closer, both as comrades and as researchers documenting our experiences. We did a couple of joint writings too. We would discuss how we should shape the content. She would encourage me to write the first draft, and then she would refine it, make it sharper, after which we would discuss this together, argue our points on which we had diverse views, and then we would bring it to its final shape. She was a good bit senior in experience and age. I was never near her in terms of scholarship. I was nowhere near her at that point of time in terms of scholarship. Yet, there was never a feeling of hierarchy, and she was never intimidating, always encouraging me to speak my mind, raising important questions as we went along, giving useful suggestions, and the end results were always good. At Kasegao, Gale's rich collection of books and periodicals was always a free for all. Her generosity of giving open access to take away whatever anybody fancied always amazed me, who was so possessive about the few books I owned and cherished. And I talked to her about this, but her logic was very simple. She would say, if you're finished reading something, why hoard it? It should circulate to others who want to read it. In my naivety, I saw this as the generosity of the privilege with access to plenty. But for Gale, embellishing her shelf with books to show to the world what a voracious reader she was had no consequence at all. And this is a valuable lesson that I've really learned from her. Another facet of Gale's personality was her ability to multitask and with such disciplined concentration. She could just sit amongst us and slip out of repetitive, tedious discussions and pick up the book she was reading, or as the prolific writer she was, bang away on the keyboard of her typewriter at fascinating speed. I think it was 100 per minute or something like that, and step back in to make a point if she felt it was relevant to the discussion. It amazed me. She never had the patience for what she felt are fruitless, repetitive, and prolonged discussions, and did not believe in showing diplomatic niceties just to be popular. There is a hilarious incident about how rockstar Gale stupefied an elite audience in Delhi at an event where she was called to speak about Ambedkar. She asked the organizers to distribute copies of her paper to the people, and then took out her guitar and sang movement songs along with Gauri. She said that in such an educated professional audience, those interested can keep and read her paper later. The mirthful narration of this incident by Gauri still brings a smile on the face. We weren't witness, but Gauri describes it very graphically. She was not one who believed in giving in to the whims of those who wanted to get legitimacy by organizing checklist events. And Gail could get away with this. That's the beauty of it. Since Gail had an established credential as a scholar, whenever activists needed her support, she was quite unhesitant if it was helpful to the movement. Joy and I were contemplating doing a study recording people's perceptions and experiences on drought and degenerated agriculture in one of our base villages as part of our search for alternatives. She suggested we apply for a grant from ICSSR. As an organization, we never took funding from any international donor agencies. She also asked us to talk to Dr. Sulbha Brahme to channelize the grant through Shankar Brahme Samaj Vignan Granthalaya. Sulbha Tai, incidentally, was another stalwart who gave unflinching support to young activists, particularly those of us who worked on rural issues. Both Joy and I were young, relatively unknown in academic circles. Sulbha Tai suggested that bringing Gail on board as principal investigator would be helpful not only to access the grant, but also for theoretical clarity. Gail readily agreed, and we gained from her research experience. Just one example will suffice here. Carrying out the study in a drought area, the classical or census classification of rural peasantry didn't quite fit into our study situation, and we discussed this with her. Gail immediately fished out a paper published from a study in a drought-affected region of Tamil Nadu, and we found our answers to present the operational classification of peasant classes for our study, which was very useful. Gail's public position and scholarship on caste subordination and oppression have, in a sense, made her a mother figure on discourses around caste, and she has been a sought-after speaker at important events. The then Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh, Digvijay Singh, wanted to invite her as a keynote speaker at a pre-Durban state conference on caste, and she was taken there in a chartered helicopter as she was not enthusiastic about a long road travel from Kasegaon to Mumbai. Those days it took 12 hours to catch a flight to Bhopal. Anyway, to cut a long story short, a senior official made inquiries and found out that the Rajaram Bapu sugar factory at Kasegaon had a private helipad. He got the necessary permissions and Gail was ferried back and forth. An honor indeed, but Gail made no ado about it. She had a merry laugh when we teased her for her eminence. The point is that Gail just went about doing what she thought is right and was never weighed down by the aura she created and the respect she commanded. I feel the famous quote of Descartes, "I think, therefore I am," applies naturally to her. Having said all these in very graphic terms, people may think that Gail and I never had any disagreements. We did, on movement-related priorities and strategies. I was more interested in strengthening the local base and developing strong local cadres, and Gail felt we should operate at a broader level, a broader canvas, and be part of large networks. It's not that I was averse to the latter, but I felt that we could not really influence networks unless we built our local organizational strength, and we were still very new and very small. When Shetkari Sangatna organized a huge gathering to launch Shetkari Sangatna's Mahila Agadi somewhere in the, I think around 86 or 87, Gail and Indutai were very impressed with the huge mobilization and its demands. I expressed my reservation on several counts. I was not convinced that women were leading the mobilization, and it was like a cult following in support of Sharad Joshi, who was a powerful farmers' movement leader. I was also unhappy about his ignoring the history and influence of the contemporary autonomous feminist movement in their women's manifesto, Chandwar Chi Shidori. In fact, he mocked this movement, which was released at the Chandwar mega gathering. I was unsure that Shetkari Sangatna represented the interests of toiling peasantry and laborers. These differences in opinion did lead to some tense discussions within the organization about the nature of our association with such initiatives, but we agreed to disagree, And Gail continued to be associated with the Women's Front of Shetkari Sangatna for many years thereafter. We also had some disagreements about the initiative to form Samagra Mahila Agadi, a very short-lived platform. Translated, it says All Women's Alliance in the late 80s. I felt that this was premature as a political strategy, since the number of politically active women in leadership was far too few, and an independent women's alliance outside the existing political parties could not be built till the women's movement itself showed up as a strong political movement going beyond issue-based campaigns, which is what it was in the 80s. I also felt that those who were encouraging this initiative were using the credentials of the women leading the idea of Samagra Mahila Agadi to fulfill their own political agendas. But Gail didn't quite see it that way. Another debate was about if mass organizations should have a structure and how these create hierarchies. Coming from the urban autonomous trend of women's groups that emerged in the mid-70s, I strongly believe that structures create hierarchies, something that feminists in our movement were trying to break out by forming collectives. Gail, with her longer association with various mainstream left as well as new left political formations, felt that a known visible hierarchy is better to be able to confront, resist, and change, rather than invisible hierarchies that seep in insidiously. She gave me a paper to read in support of her thinking. The title has now faded, but it talked about the oppression of non-structuredness. So despite all these disagreements, I think our family ties sustained even after we officially split from the parent Shramik Mukti Dal some years ago, about 10, 12 years ago. So just as Kasigaon was second home for Joy and me during our activism days, our home, when we shifted to Pune, was a transit center during activist meetings and when people traveled to other places via Pune. Over the years, it became a second home for the Patankar family too. We have many fond memories of family get-togethers here and Prachi nurturing our daughter Mansi as her little sister. They are 11 years apart. I recall a conversation between 3-year young Manasi and me in the aftermath of the fall of Babri Masjid and the riots in Mumbai and the bomb blast thereafter and the Mandal, anti-Mandal agitations. You know, all these discussions at home were really affecting the young mind. So one night, as I was putting her to bed, I heard her sniffling and asked her about it. She shared that she was afraid of being left alone if both Joy and I got killed. While I tried to comfort her by saying that one of us was always with her when the other traveled out, yet, being the very practical and honest mother that I was, I asked her to imagine that if such an unlikely event ever happened, who other person she could turn to. After a brief thought, Mansi started listing the names, and the first names were Gail Kaku and Bharat Kaka, followed by a few other close family friends from the movement. And her own grandparents came 5th and 6th down this list. I was amazed, touched, and humbled at the same time that our daughter had also started identifying with our affinity to our movement families. So later, when Gail was working in Pune University, she was living with us for several months till she was allotted her quarters. She and Mansi often had planned favorite pizza parties at home. Both of them are pizza lovers. And Mansi still carries the memories of their many conversations when Gail logically answered difficult questions that she freely asked her. Gail was also a lover of Joy's cooking, and he enjoyed pampering her taste and getting her compliments. So I would say that this kind of an alternate family is something that we will always cherish and uphold, and we have lived the end of Gail era as and mourned as well as celebrated as any family member would. I would like to end my presentation with a translation of the last stanza of one of the poems written by Bharat for his partner Gail over many months of a prolonged illness. The published book titled Sakhi, with a compilation of 20 Marathi poems, was released on September 5th, the day we organized the memoriam program for Gail at Kasegaon. That also happens to be Bharat's birthday. So I read out the translation. I still look into your eyes with the memories of the dreams of that evening. They remain alive in my heart every moment, our historical journey together, with the implacable desire committed to change and era. And I think this just about sums up the kind of partnership that Bharat and Gail shared as partners in the movement, and something we all try to emulate. Thank you. Merin, you're muted.
Yeah. I just observed it. Thank you so much.
I hope I've not overshot my time too much.
No, that's all right. That's perfectly fine. You've done justice to the topic. Thank you so much, and for giving so many insights. There are so many things to take away from this entire talk of yours, especially as she was just not a scholar or just not an activist. She was intersectionalities of caste, class, and gender. So that's something that you brought out really well. Her experience as a scholar, as a Fulbright scholar coming to India, and then her immersing into the movement, her alliance, her partnership with Dr. Bharat Patankar. Then also, that part was something that was very interesting about the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law dynamics in the Bhutai, and many other things that you have brought. And I like the way that you brought the scholarly aspects from the 3 books particularly, and then other books also in that sense, and then the activism that you mentioned so well. So thank you so much for bringing out so many things to an audience who wouldn't know Gail that well, but you have done great justice, and especially the Maharashtra politics and the rural area and your activism involvement brings a lot of aspects into the account. So really grateful to you for taking this time, this effort. She's actually prepared a 12 or 13 pages document or a dossier for this.
14.
Yeah, that's Nagmani Rao. She doesn't do anything that is half-hearted or anything. So thank you so much for being so proactive, and I really hope, if nothing else, those who have attended today as students, as comrades, as friends, the infectious life of Gail has been transmitted. At the same time, the passion for academics and for the movement is very well evidently told by you. So I thank you once again on that count. And I open for those who would like to add on to questions. One problem with our students would be today is that we've not had light for a long time. So, the net is down. So therefore, that's the reason why so many videos are off. Even, so that's one reason. So I would request anyone who would like to add something about Gail, or, as there are more than students here, your students are also here. Anybody who would like to add on, and, that would add meaning to today's meeting. Over to the house is open. You just have to just raise your eyes. Jovita, yeah. She was one of our speakers last time, and Jovita is in Georgia. So Jovita, do you want to ask a question? Is that how I understand?
Acha, I'll wait for your students to finish. I'm just here as a guest, so I won't take their time. I'll wait. I have a couple of questions, but I'll wait for your students to take
Sure. Nagmani, Jovita was here for one of our sessions on Afghanistan, as she's been in Afghanistan for in her capacities for the last 21 years in a lot of sense. And so she gave a lot of insight in the last conversation that we had, but that was a lot more unstructured meeting. and not under the thing. So yeah, just introduce you to that. Anil is here. Others are also there. I think Deepak Abhinave is here, your student. Deepali Chavan is there. So just wanting you to know that, these are the people that are here around. Even one of my faculty, Reverend Dr. Baiju Marcos, he's here. So our principal is right now in Kerala, so he gives wishes. And he was also happy to know that we were here. So if Jovita, as I told you, there's a connection issue. So maybe, I think, Deepak, are you going to ask? Yes, Dr. Deepak Abhinave, who's a teacher at TISS. Where exactly, Deepak, could you just introduce yourself before you ask the question?
In Tuljapur, basically. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, hi.
Mani, I just want to ask just one doubt. GAIL has a political affiliation with the Marxist organization, but she supported globalization. She argues that globalization will bring new scientific technology and that will uplift Dalit, Adivasi, and also women. So what is your take on?
See, I think there are, in fact, I want to touch upon two kind of misunderstandings due to selective reading by GAIL when people have talked about her supporting globalization. To answer your question first, it's not that when she supported globalization, she actually supported free market economy. She did not talk about doing away with state responsibility. From whatever I have discussed with Bharat, as well as some of the readings he has sent me of the time. But what she felt, and here I think a lot of Dalit groups have also talked about this, that the opening out of opportunities due to global influences, in fact, does lead to, access to technology, access to markets, access to different kinds of education, and so on. And I think this was her logic. One may disagree with certain aspects, and I would like to read much more of what she has written. But recently, Bahujan Samaj, I think, had organized one of the memorials in which somebody who was associated with Shetkari Sangatna had spoken, and he clearly stated, it's reported to me, that GAIL was not supporting liberalization, economic liberalization, even in the context of globalization. In fact, in various meetings in Shetkari Sangatna, she kept raising these issues of equity, equality, what does it imply for the toiling sections, and how will Shetkari Sangatna take up these issues so that the toiling sections, the Dalits, the women are not marginalized in this kind of a peasant movement. So I think she had a very nuanced understanding about these things, but unfortunately, people kind of read it selectively. The other thing I want to really talk about, which I had in my presentation, but I have not talked about it because of lack of time, is this whole thing about GAIL was in favor of the Sardar Sarovar dam. I think people have misunderstood that position also, because all of us who were working in drought areas with low rainfall, in fact, we're talking about, the Narmada Sardar Sarovar project, and it raised a lot of controversy. GAIL basically articulated what we within Shramik Mukti Dal at that point of time were discussing. So she, in fact, was pointing out that the submergence should be reduced as much as possible, and it should not be ignored that there is a large area. At the same time, it should not be ignored that there is a large area which is drought prone, which was driving people to migrate to the cities. And all of us who were working in rural areas which were drought affected could see the need for bringing in water from outside. So in that sense, when GAIL wrote about the Sardar Sarovar project, she was supporting what Date, Joy, and Suhas Paranjpe wrote based on our discussions within Shramik Mukti Dal to freeze the dam at a certain height. And this would have at that time saved 75% of submergence and also given water to the drought-prone area. The entire SMD, in fact, had sent representatives to Gujarat to talk to the people, including MEDA and NBA activists. The alternative proposed tried to combine the interest of drought-affected regions and rehabilitation of dam displaced based on the principle of equity and also to prevent further displacement. Unfortunately, despite NBA acknowledging the merits of this alternative, and I was present in some of these meetings, they were not willing to budge from their no dam position on which their organization was built. And so they didn't put their weight behind the alternative, which I think was a major loss. Because if they had, perhaps the history of displacement would have been changed. So there are many such things. So I would say that one needs to, have a more nuanced understanding by reading a little thoroughly about Gale's writings at various points of time, which I do hope to do in the next some years, because it's so extensive that it's easy to, through selective reading, it's easy to misunderstand what she has written and taking it out of context. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak. Thank you, Mani. And Jovita, you can ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. I think I learned more of Gale than all my readings of her in many years. So thank you so much. Two questions, if I may, and one is very basic, given the fact that you also knew her personally. How much did the fact that she was a foreigner working in rural India influence her role and her clarity of thought and her acceptance? So acceptance with the rural audience and her own clarity of seeing caste issues differently than some of us who were raised in the system could see it. And my second question is more personal. I've also worked in community development, but not in India, mostly the Balkans and Afghanistan, and in participatory rural appraisal. And I've always noticed that when you tend to do this work, you get labeled either as a feminist, as an activist, as a Marxist, whatever. I want to ask you as a friend, how did Gale identify herself, and what was the labels she identified with? And I know some of us who actually work in this field hate the label of activist because that at once creates a barrier with certain audiences. So how did she identify herself? Over.
Okay, I'll answer your second question first because it's just a 2 or 3 liner. Gale's, I think, credentials are more as an activist. Even if you look at her research and her writing, they are rooted in movements, and that is probably it is very empathetic to the rural toiler, most of whom are Dalits, Bahujans, and so I would say that even if Gale was not continuously mobilizing as a grassroots activist, her thinking process, her discussions, and when she conducted meetings, I mean, she's traveled extensively in the Adivasi areas of Dhule, in across Maharashtra, and also in other states. And she was, in that sense, a very grassroots person. And I don't think she was at all apologetic about her activist credentials. That was very clear. And probably that also explains the resistance to her in higher academics. Somebody talked about the Brahmanism in higher academics and her representing the Bahujan voice. That could also explain why she never got any kind of a permanent post in any of the renowned universities. I'm just, conjecturing like many people have done. And so in that sense, she was radically different. And just yesterday, I met Professor Dahiwale of Savitribai Phule University, who's retired from the Department of Sociology. And he was saying that it's despite Gale's scholarship and contribution, and a lot of people, even in the university, have admired her work, she was never a faculty in any of the departments. The topics she wrote about were not part of the curriculum. They were taken up by individual teachers who read and appreciated her, and beyond being invited for conferences or, these kinds of things to give legitimacy through her name, I think she did not get the respect that she deserved in academics, despite her contribution. Now, coming back to your first question, which was, oh gosh, it's blanked out. Can you just repeat it? Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, how does her being a foreigner,
Yeah. Dr. Nagamani Rao, just a minute. I think that question also has something to do with another question that is there in the chat box by Reverend Vijay Eapen. So I'll just read it out for you.
Yeah, please.
Thanks for that presentation on Gail Omved, Dr. Nagamani Rao. Just one question. Where do we locate Gail Omved in the whole discourse about representation and subjective experience of one's subalternity? So this also is like, there are some articles that have said that she's portrayed as a messiah, from as an outsider and things like that. So, this, I mean, it is in these lines, like, why should somebody else represent, or, to that effect?
See, I kind of look at it in this way, that just because she was a born American, just because she came from abroad, I mean, she's been labeled from being a CIA agent to, what does she, how dare she talk about India? There have been these kinds of things. And I think after her death, when there were all these writings paying tributes to her, the right-wing people have also talked about this American connection and what does she know about India, without even reading anything of what she has written or trying to understand. So to me, even thinking of her as an outsider, Merin also said her movement from being outsider to insider, how does it happen? I think somewhere it is ingrained in her by the choices she made. Coming to India to do the study, influenced by Eleanor, then subsequently wanting to continue to live in India. And the only way she could continue to live in India during those times of the political situation was to get married to an Indian, and then choosing to get married to somebody who comes from a toiling section background and is an activist in the left movement. I think these speak a lot about what Gail desired and also lived by. So she could have reached places if she continued to. I mean, she's graduated from Berkeley, very well known. She's been invited, but I think she was not somebody who wanted to be queen in that sense. The crown was uncomfortable for her, and in that sense, I think and she was so internalizing the Bahujan lens, the Dalit lens, through all her studies. These were the things which made her so acceptable to people. Yes, her Marathi was heavily American accented till you got used to the way she spoke. One couldn't understand. People assume she doesn't know Marathi, but she actually wrote in Marathi popular press. Of course, Bharat would help her in correcting the language, but she wrote original Marathi herself and then got it corrected. So it means she had also started thinking in Marathi rather than translating from English to Marathi, which many of us do, who are not born Maharashtrian. So these are some of the things I would say where she really identified herself with the soil of India. I mean, people are also glorifying it. Some of the eulogies are talking about the blonde, beautiful woman from the West who came and became part of the Dalit Bahujan. I find this absurd, and I don't think Gail would have liked this kind of a description about her. I find it personally very offensive and uncomfortable when people talk about her physical looks and then how she became such a tribute to India. She's not the sort who would like this kind of a glorification at all, knowing her groundedness. So I think probably settling down. I mean, she could have chosen to live in any of the cities. She chose to keep Kasegao as her home. And I think a lot had to do with the family ethos that Indutai had created, the kind of respect that she felt for the movement and her own involvement. And I hope this answers the kinds of questions you're raising. In the way I have understood your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ram.
Yes, I'm actually, just a minute, I'll put it on the gallery view. Whose question was that? There was a voice between. Okay. Nobody, I guess. Okay. Anil, you had a question. You had raised your hand, so you can go ahead.
Thanks, Mani, for that. Absolutely fantastic. It shows how close you were. And I think just in addition to what you said regarding Narmada Basavi, the Baliraja struggle debate, I think that also should need to be contextualized in the discourse of movements actually. So many things are happening over here, many things are happening over there. The priorities are different, the leadership thought processes are different, and it just cannot be seen as a. These are also discourses among movements also, which needs to see in that context, which definitely movements will disagree to and needs to be seen in that context completely. But then it is also the academics who come later or else who are interested to actually figure out what actually happened in the movement and how do they actually place it from a, I will say, an outsider perspective or whatever things also makes it a bit complicated. But saying that since you personally also have been with the family and things like that, in my understanding, in my knowledge, there have been many people from the West who have come to India, stayed, be it from missionaries or anything like that. But within the social action per se, I think Gail for one, this one, and definitely if I remember the feminist, Merin, you would know it better in Tamil Nadu theology, the feminist scholar, Bas Vilanka and Gabriel.
Gabriel Dietrich. She was there, by the way. She was there for Gail's memoriam and spoke beautifully.
Exactly. So was that something to do with the 50s, 60s of this passion towards India coming in? Because there is you can see that that movement actually coming in, and that engagement of, was there any discourse on international solidarity in terms of that ways at that point of time, or is it was just that? Because it's a bit curious, because then the discussions also be it in the movement or within the academic discourse also, social analysis discourse also, there are a lot. I can't say that it is completely universal within India, but in certain important things, I'm just looking at the possibilities of that. 60s also was once again, 60s, 70s was once again Latin American liberation theology. Most of that in the West, there was a hippie culture also, which was very predominant. That is one set of my question. The second set is that what has been your experience, especially with the development activities within Kasegao? I know that Bharat's family comes from a very illustrious activism background. You have that cultural capital, definitely, martyrship, freedom struggle, a huge. What has been on the front of development activities per se? Has there been any kind of initiatives on that front? That's my personal curiosity. Since you told that she played guitar in front of an audience, that was a different political, expression as far as I'm concerned. But has there been that kind of initiatives or something like that?
See, there are actually three people who, kind of came to India more or less one after another. One is, of course, Gabriel Dietrich, amongst the people that I know. Gabriel Dietrich, Gail Ombet, and Meera Sadgopal. Three very different people, three whose trajectories are also very different. In that sense, Meera Sadgopal has been more a development activist. Of course, she was very active in the Union Carbide, Zehreeli Gas Kand, Sangharsh Morcha, and People's Science Movement. Then there is Gabriel Dietrich, who did come from a Marxist background, but had a combination of Marxist grounding with development work in Tamil Nadu, and also very closely associated with the feminist movement. and subsequently, of course, a supporter for NB. In fact, I remember Gail coming to Sangli when we were working there and spending a number of days with us. She came to meet Gail, but she traveled around with us to some of the women's meetings and all that. And we had had a lot of discussion. And then Gail, who came with a very clear political commitment. Possibly because of their differential histories, Gabriel part of a theological kind of a setup, married also to a fellow Austrian. Meera married to an Indian, but working in the villages of MP, and Gail very clearly making a political preference. I would not even refer to it as a trend, Anil, that had an international ramification. From my limited understanding, because if it had been a trend, many, many more people would have come to India. That has not happened. I think the people who came to India and decided to make India their home and internalize to some extent the value system from their own locations, of course, speaks something about what they were as persons. And so I would not generalize in that sense, because I don't think that would be right. We do not have enough information to say that this was a trend. Many people have come and gone, worked as development workers, and so on. But I would say that Gail was clearly political right till the end. She was not somebody who came with any other agenda, but to bring about change. And her commitment was, and that's why she and Bharat also converted to Buddhism. One of the debates that I have not talked about in my presentation is in one of the Vidrohi conferences, I even said moving from Marxism into religion and Buddhism at that. Why? When all of us have been atheists. So we did have some discussions, but somehow the discussions did not lead to much more in-depth exchanges thereafter, partly because of our political split, partly many other reasons. But Gail was convinced about many things that were Indian, and that reflects her Indianness in that sense, whatever that means, because in one of her books, she talks about the Bahujan vision of what is India, rather than the Brahmanical vision of India. And so I think she was rooted in Dalit Bahujan tradition, and it began with her PhD work, but even later, when she was with the Nehru Memorial, and she interacted a lot with people who were Buddhist scholars, who were Dalit scholars, she has gained a lot during that tenure. And that is where you see her, going to Tamil Nadu, going to Andhra Pradesh, engaging with people like Kancha Ilaya and many others. So you find this kind of a very strong commitment. I don't think she has used the word subaltern, if I'm not mistaken. I need to read up a little more. Many people have treated her as a subaltern theorist, but I think she used the more political word of Dalit and Bahujan whenever she talked about these things. So your question was quite complex and it had many layers. So I don't think I've done justice in answering your question, but this is what I feel. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess we'll,
There's somebody called George Matthews who has his hand up.
Matthews George.
Matthews George.
Matthews George.
Yeah.
Sorry, Matthews George.
Yes, Matthews George.
Thank you, ma'am, for the enlightening session and your scholarly and personal portrait of Gail Ombed. We have only referred to her, but now you have shared a personal memory and painted a wonderful portrait for us. Ma'am, I had come across during an assignment on Ambedkar, her work, Ambedkar towards an enlightened India, where she contrasts Ambedkar with Gandhi and says, generally in India, Ambedkar is always understood in opposition with or juxtaposed with Gandhi, whereas she begins by saying Ambedkar for the Dalits is somebody who needs to be seen on his own right as a world figure like Marx rather than in contrast to Gandhi. In your association, how did Dr. Amved's approach towards Ambedkar and the Buddhism that he espoused, how did it come across to you? Would you say more about her affinity for Ambedkar? Secondly, one more small question. It's more on a personal note. As a scholar and as a researcher and as a guide, how do you go about keeping notes and taking notes and referring to them and using them in articles and engaging with them? What system do you use that you have used over the years, which has been useful for you to remember what you have read and taken down? Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. The first question, Matthews, I may not be able to answer because the particular book that you have referred to, I have not read. Okay. Yeah, I think Gail has at some point of time contrasted, I mean, even in Begumpura, she talks about it, where she says that Gandhi's vision of what is Indian and what is, giving dignity to the Harijans is quite different from the kind of cultural change that Ambedkar talked about. Okay, so this is something, and also I don't know if any of you have read Ilyana Zilet's very small book on the whole journey of conversion by Ambedkar. How he moved from trying to bring about change within the Hindu fold and then moved from there. He explored Islam, he explored Sikh, and finally how he moved towards Buddhism. It's a very interesting kind of journey of how he moved towards Buddhism. And I think Gail understood this kind of a thinking of how Ambedkar grappled with ground reality and also made strategic choices based on the experiences. So that's all I would say as far as the whole enlightenment that Ambedkar talked about and what Gail felt about it. But as I said, I will not be able to dwell upon it in detail till I read the particular thing, the particular reference that you have talked about. As I said, I have not read all of Gail. There are some things I've been reading of late, particularly when she started falling sick, and I just felt I needed to know Gail better as a scholar, beyond being a personal friend and a fellow activist. So yeah, so that engagement would continue, and hopefully if I read enough, I'll write about it also. Coming to your second question on how do you take notes, I really am at a loss because I have evolved through experience of research. But I can tell you during my PhD journey, what I did, which is the most recent kind of thing. I had read, I don't know how many thousand pages because my PhD journey was very long. And just 1 second, my battery is going to die out, so I'm going to have to charge it. 1 second before it collapses. Yep. Yeah, I think now we are safe. Yeah. So what I was saying is that, so what I started doing was, I made a lot of annotations. In my first rounds of readings, I made annotations, and because of computer technology, it becomes easier. I belong to the traditional notes-taking person that I was when I started my PhD journey. I was not so savvy with the use of computers. So at that time, I had pages and pages of notes in my register, and I kept a margin in which, I would put remarks or instructions to myself of how one should write, what I feel about the book or the reference that I've looked at, and of course all the detailed bibliographical notes, because composing a bibliography as a researcher is perhaps the most painful thing. And I tell you, when I have edited or copy edited works, the lack of complete references is really a problem for editors. And so that's why having complete references noted down. So for my PhD, what I did was I prepared a master list of references. As and when I read something, whether it was downloaded from the net or whether it was in some library, I wrote down where I had taken it from. And then I would, I prepared a master bibliography. And then later I started putting notes on the margins saying, this will be useful for such and such a chapter, or this will be useful for the introduction, this will be useful when I draw up the tools, this will be useful for the theoretical, because the same source reading can be useful for many purposes. And we read so much that finally we forget what we have read. And and then I would also put down comments like, for later reading more extensively, for more in-depth reading. So I would keep putting all these little instructions to myself so that I don't forget. The other is, how do you take down what you want to take down? Today, it is very easy to, copy paste. But plagiarism operates, so you're going to have to paraphrase. Now, I'll tell you what problems I had, because I had paraphrased so much, and also you're reading the same thing from 3-4 different sources, that when I actually had to, write down the textual references, it became very problematic for me. And I lost a lot of time because I didn't know where exactly I had picked up that particular reference from, because I had paraphrased it into my own words and added my own thoughts. So what I learned from that is that write down somewhere that you have accessed it from 2-3 these references, so that when you actually do on text referencing, which is very important when you write for journals or academic books, it's very important that your bibliographical list also matches with your on text referencing. And when we are very conscious about not plagiarizing other people's work, but wanting to acknowledge the sources, this becomes very important. And so as a researcher, one doesn't keep the bibliography for the end. One actually starts making bibliographical listings from the day you start reading. So that's the advice I would give any of you who are, going to be academic researchers. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Again, as Anil has said, it looks like a research methodology lab that we attended long back. Anyways, thank you so much, Dr. Nagmani Rao, for today, for taking such elaborate time, almost to 1.5 hours and a little more, and to personally answer so many questions. And I'm sure there are many more questions that are there among people who have come. But thank you for your time and your investment today. It's good to see Deepak. Hi, Deepak. I'm good to see you after such a long time, actually. And all other students who have joined today. Thank you so much. And once again, Dr. Nagmani Rao, on behalf of Dharmajyoti Vidyapeeth, I take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of our students, on behalf of the community that has come here to learn together, for giving us a deeper insight, for helping us to learn. And our students had some issues in following you because of the connection issues, as I told you, that there was some amount of net issues here. So they were asking whether you would be kind enough to send the notes that you prepared or the presentation.
I'll do that.
Yeah, so that, they can go through that. And
I'll do that. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Thank you. And I'll end the recording. Those who want to stay back and chat, please stay back. The rest of you all, thank you very, very much.